Okay, are we ready to start? Okay, I can start, can I? We're all ready? In that case, it's first to welcome everybody to this panel on trade and socio-ecological transition. I'm Martin Myant, Associate Researcher at ETUI, and I will chair this session. The basic question, if you like, we've had an expansion and liberalization of trade over the last few decades, and by some we're told that is the road to prosperity for all. By others, we're told globalization brings threats and or has led to a worsening in employment, environmental conditions, and other problems. Try to find a balance, if there is one. We have four speakers: Olivier de Schutter, Sarah Leakage, Christian Valenduc, and Jan Olby. It means 10 minutes each for them to give an introduction. We will then have questions, answers, and discussion. Okay, all four speakers in order, and the questions come after that. Anyone can put questions through the Q&A facility down towards the bottom of the screen. Please don't use chat. That is not meant for anything other than the actual speakers. And then questions that have come in, they can be answered directly in writing or in speech by the speakers. I may use some of them to press speakers more on, take those as questions to ask. So to say something about the speakers, Olivier is Professor of International Human Rights Law, European Union Law and Legal Theory at the University of Louvain. That's Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. Currently also UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. So I took some questions to set the sort of context for what he would say from the publicity for a book he wrote, published in 2015, Trade in the Service of Sustainable Development. And the questions I've got: can we continue to claim to protect the rights of workers and to improve environmental protection within an agenda focused on trade liberalization? Can we aim to expand the volumes of trade without linking such policies to labor and environmental standards? And can trade work for sustainable development? Sarah is Trade Policy Officer at the Veblen Institute in Paris, previously worked in Latin America, also in France, always on themes relating to environmental and social challenges and problems. And I took some simple questions from publications from the Veblen Institute. What should be done so that the meat we consume does not contribute to deforestation of the Amazon, that workers who make our clothes or who mine rare materials used in our telephones do not risk their lives for evidence? She will answer more broadly and also say what ideas are being developed at the Veblen Institute to reform trade rules and what difference they would make. Christian, he's held high positions in the Belgian Ministry of Finance and also worked in international organizations as well. Also professor at Louvain-la-Neuve and also associate researcher at ETUI working on tax policy. So questions: can tax policy in the European Union work to mitigate climate change? Does this require common policies across all countries? And how can that be achieved? How can that work? Jan Olby is Director of the Centre for EU Studies and Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at Kent University in Belgium. Several books he's written relating to EU external policies and the EU's global role. So questions that obviously relate to that: what is the record specifically of EU trade policies? Have past agreements served to find a balance between environmental and labour rights concerns and liberalisation? And is there a specific EU contribution to international trade policy? I threw in a fifth question for everybody. Does COVID-19 point to the need for any re-evaluation? Does it change what we think? Does it reinforce what we've been saying all along? Whatever. So good. So without further ado, if Olivier, it should be over to you now to start.
Thank you, Martin. Very warm welcome to all on this panel, and I'm delighted to share this this panel with you. And thank you for allowing me to use not only the video but also a PowerPoint, which I will use to make my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, which shall allow me to enter into our discussion. So first of all, I'd like to note that when in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly following the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a very strong push towards accelerating trade liberalization. And that was when the Uruguay round of trade negotiations was concluded to establish the WTO. There were very strong hopes that this would allow sustainable development, both by raising levels of employment and by ensuring a more efficient use of natural resources. In fact, if we look at the agreement establishing the WTO in 1994, the preamble is explicit about this. Trade was meant, and this is what you see on this in this paragraph, to raise standards of living, ensure full employment, a large and steadily growing volume of real income and effective demand, and allow the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. Now, why this hope? It's fairly easy to reconstruct why in both the area of environmental standards and labor rights, these hopes were expressed that trade liberalization could allow us to put us on a sustainable trajectory. If we consider first labor rights, the idea was that labor rights would allow not only standards of living to improve in countries where wages were relatively low and therefore could be attractive to investors for the most labor-intensive segments of production, but in addition, in global supply chains, unions, NGOs could be more effective in protecting workers' rights, and there would be greater pressure for consumers to ensure that essential labor rights are complied with. In the area of environmental standards, similarly, there was the hope that consumer pressure would allow the best practices to become universal, that the goods that would be produced abroad would be produced with less polluting methods through the transfer of technologies and the sale of intermediate goods as well as machinery. And most importantly, perhaps, environmental standards could improve thanks to the fact that the deepening of the division of labor would allow a more efficient use of the world's resources, given that each country would specialize according to its comparative advantage. And that was meant as, or perceived as a source of efficiency. Now, I will argue that these hopes were based on an unrealistic picture of the reality and have been disappointed. Let me take first environmental standards. The first lesson that we have learned since the 1980s and 90s is that trade liberalization has actually allowed the phenomenon referred to as carbon leakage. To put it in a nutshell, some countries, industrialized countries, have committed under the Kyoto Protocol, complementing the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to reduce the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, as we well know. And this was, of course, confirmed in the Paris Agreement of 12th of December 2015. But the initial agreement in Kyoto in 1997, entered into force in 2005, was imposing on rich countries, to put it summarily, to stem the growth of greenhouse gas emissions. However, it was quite deliberately crafted, this agreement, to allow those countries to comply with their commitments without changing anything in our lifestyles, without imposing any sacrifices on consumers, simply by outsourcing the most polluting segments of the industry and by importing back the goods that are produced abroad to satisfy those lifestyles I've referred to. And that was not a mistake, it was not an oversight, it was the result of the way emissions are computed under the Kyoto Protocol system, based essentially on what emissions are produced within a particular territory without looking at the carbon or carbon equivalent embedded in the products imported to satisfy our consumption. And the result is carbon leakage. In fact, it means that what rich countries have been importing from developing countries has been much more carbon intensive than what they have been exporting to those countries. And this is illustrated by this map that shows the flow of imports and exports between China, the EU and the US, Russia. The thickness of each of these arrows indicates the carbon intensity of the trade relationships. So for example, you see here that what the EU imports from China is far more intensive in carbon per value exported by China than what the EU exports to China. So this is a first major problem. The second major problem, this first major problem is illustrated again by these most recent graphs from the Global Emissions Gap Report of 2019 from United Nations Environment Programme that shows the difference between the territorial calculation of greenhouse gas emissions and the calculation that we would arrive at if we took into account the consumption in each territory, including the carbon emissions embedded in what is imported to satisfy that consumption. So for example, for China, on the left graph here, for China, the territorial computation of emissions is higher than what would result from examining consumption, simply because a significant part of China's production is meant for exports, reducing, in fact, as a result, the calculation of emissions if we took into account only Chinese consumption. Conversely, for the EU, on the same graph on the left, the territorial count of emissions is lower than what would be counted if we looked at consumption. So that's the first problem. The second problem we've encountered is also well documented. It is that the hopes placed in the greening of production by the diffusion of green, clean technologies have been entirely wiped out by what is called the revenue effect from trade liberalization, by which is meant that we can consume goods and purchase goods at a very low price, thanks to the efficiency gains resulting from the growth of international trade. In other terms, the trade liberalization and the efficiency gains resulting from economies of scale in global supply chains have allowed people to consume much more than they otherwise might have been able to, and this has entirely erased any benefits that might have been expected from technological advances linked to the attempt to green the economy. So unfortunately, the promise that trade liberalization would result in a net environmental gain, these hopes have been disappointed. With regard to labor rights and working conditions, here I have to say it is much more complicated to make a general assessment. And the reason for this is different parts of the global working force have been affected in very different ways by globalization, by the growth of international trade and foreign investment. And as we know from the work of Branko Milanovic, for example, on global inequalities, there have been significant gains for a global middle class in Southeast Asia, in China, and to a large extent in India, from the globalization of the economy. Conversely, those that have gained much less in comparison are the working class people in rich countries, with low levels of qualification and whose revenues have been mostly affected by globalization and by technological developments. And we therefore have a very disparate picture of the impact on workers' rights of globalization. It's also difficult to make general assessments because there's a difference between labor rights as stipulated in regulations and laws and labor conditions, which are the effective practices under which workers operate. And there's sometimes a huge gap between the legal rules as they may have evolved, particularly under the pressure of unions and consumer groups or NGOs, and on the other hand, the effective working conditions in certain jurisdictions. Moreover, the impacts of trade on labor rights and labor conditions depend on a range of factors illustrated on this slide, including the weight of labor unions, the question of the conditions imposed by the buyers and foreign investors, the competition with local producers. So it's very difficult to make a general assessment in this regard. And this explains that the debates on the social dimension of trade liberalization have continued since the start of the WTO. As you may recall, the first WTO ministerial conference convened in Singapore in 1996 was very much about this social clause that at the time the US President Bill Clinton sought to have inserted in the WTO. And the result was, of course, this ministerial conference declaration about the division of tasks that should be established between the ILO and the WTO, the ILO in charge of developing and monitoring labor standards, and the WTO in charge of ensuring trade liberalization. And this declaration essentially was a declaration in which the ministers agreed that the two secretariats should continue to work together, but that labor standards should not be used as a pretext to resort to protectionist policies. And the statement, which many of you would be familiar with, adds that the ministers agree that the comparative advantage of countries, particularly low-wage developing countries, must in no way be put into question. In other terms, these developing countries obtained in Singapore in 1996 to have an agreement on the idea that it could be their competitive advantage in the global economy to keep their workers poor and not to raise wages, not to raise social contributions to be paid by employers to contributory social security funds. And that, I think, is deeply problematic, is not sustainable. I have been traveling to countries where governments told me, we cannot afford to raise wages because our only comparative advantage in the current competition is that our workers are cheap and our unions not powerful enough to seek higher wages. So I think it is deeply unsustainable, but unfortunately, it is a reality in many countries in the world today. So this is why I believe we should think about linking trade to social rights, labor rights, and to environmental standards. And this can be done. In fact, there's a very important debate within the legal community about linkage and the acceptability under the WTO disciplines of linking labor rights and environmental standards as conditionalities to trade policies. And the difficulty of the debate is that labor and environmental conditionalities focus not on the physical characteristics of the product, but on the production process methods, in other terms, how they are produced, under which conditions. And secondly, such a linkage is outward looking. The importing country, the EU in the European context, is looking at labor conditions, say in Bangladesh, in China, or in Sri Lanka. It's looking at environmental standards in those countries, not at the impacts on the consumers buying these goods that have been imported in the EU. However, I believe that neither of these two arguments are decisive. It is agreed now that it is legitimate for countries to express a concern about how goods are produced and not simply about their physical characteristics, particularly since the buyers today, the consumers, express concern about the conditions under which goods were produced. And the purchasing practices of consumers have evolved in such a way that it becomes legitimate for governments to impose that condition. So what can be done to ensure this linkage? I don't have time really to go through all the tools that could be used, but I would say that they can be classified in three categories. First of all, we have unilateral tools that can be used. The EU, for example, in its GSP schemes, generalized systems of preferences schemes, now under regulation 978/2012 for the period 2014-2024, that's the latest, has provided special advantages to countries that comply with ILO conventions, human rights treaties, and multilateral environmental agreements, rewarding these countries for acceding to those instruments and for implementing them effectively. That is called GSP+. It's an example of conditionality, and it is a practice that has been in fact validated by an appellate panel within the WTO. So it's compatible with the non-discrimination requirement under the GATT agreement of the WTO. A second unilateral tool is supply chain monitoring. We have the example of the 2010 timber regulation, the example of the 2017 conflict minerals regulation, which impose due diligence obligations on importers to ensure that the import of timber or conflict minerals would not fuel deforestation or conflicts for the second regulation. And there is now expected from the European Commission a new legislative proposal on due diligence in global supply chains that could make this a general system. Thirdly, another unilateral tool that we expect the Commission to present in the next few weeks, or at least months, is the famous carbon border tax. The border tax adjustment that is allowed under Article 2.2a of the GATT agreement, allowing for such border tax adjustments to compensate for the taxes imposed on local producers, to avoid those local producers being exposed to unfair competition from abroad. And the European Council conclusions of 21st of July 2020 announces proposals on this by early 2021. I suspect it's going to be very difficult for the European Commission to come up with a viable scheme for a carbon border tax, in particular because we do not have a unified, harmonized carbon tax within the EU. We do have, of course, the emissions trading scheme of the EU since 2003, but that only concerns a limited number of sectors, and it is not generally agreed amongst jurists that this is a tax in the sense of what the GATT agreement allows when it speaks of a border tax adjustment. Nevertheless, we do have these tools we could use. A second set of tools—
Oh, you have 10 minutes. Are you coming to a close?
Yes, absolutely. So this is my last slide and my last sentences. So the second type of approach we could have is in trade agreements. As we know, sustainable development chapters have been recently strengthened in the most recent trade agreements negotiated by the EU. And there's a reference to further strengthening those in the 2018 action plan on the implementation of the trade and sustainable development chapters of EU's free trade agreements that was presented. We now have an EU Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, Mr. Denis Redonnet, appointed in July 2020 to monitor this. We have in an agreement such as the EU-Mercosur agreement, a stronger mechanism for dispute settlement around sustainable development. I still think this EU-Mercosur agreement is absolutely catastrophic for other reasons, but it's true that we are making progress in ensuring that these sustainable development chapters have some teeth and are taken more seriously by our trading partners. I still believe we are not going to achieve much with these agreements, but I might detail this in the discussion that shall follow. Thirdly, of course, there is the multilateral route. And within the WTO itself, some imagine that there could be a room, a space for incorporating stronger sustainability dimensions. I do not think that is a viable route, given the difficulties we have today at multilateral level to achieve an agreement. But for the sake of completeness, I believe it deserves to figure on the set of options that we have. So to conclude, I think we could do much more. The EU represents, we should never forget this, some 20% of the global GDP. This is enough to ensure that our trading practices, our trade policies send a very strong message worldwide as to the kind of humane globalization we wish and as to the kind of contribution to sustainable development we want to make by linking trade to labor rights and to environmental conditionalities. And with this, I would like to thank you again for involving me on this panel. And I very much look forward to my co-panelists' presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I think the setting out the problems, I doubt whether we'll have very much disagreement on that. The big problem.
You are muted, Martin.
Unmute. Okay, was I muted the whole time? So thank you anyway for the presentation. Problem's fairly clear. What we do about it, the big problem. And socio-ecological should be the next speaker. Are you there?
Yes,
Yep.
I'm here. I'll try to share my screen. Doesn't look so. Okay, I'm not sure I can actually share my screen. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, I think it works now. Can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, good morning everyone, and thank you for inviting me and inviting us to talk about the Veblen Institute's proposals to go beyond free trade. The idea is that it is possible technically and politically to implement a new trade policy that answers today environmental and social challenges. So there are, I'm going to go quickly about this because Olivier has done a very good explanation of those, but there are international commitments on climate, such as the Paris Agreement with the threshold of 1.5 degree of global warming, the international commitments on biodiversity. There's obviously all the ILO conventions on social norms, but as we know, it's not enough and we are overall not on the right path. And international trade has a role to play in it. Inequalities are growing and we've talked about this already. We are not on the right path on climate. So trade is responsible for 1/4 of global CO2 emissions, and global emissions increase almost at the same rate as global GDP. So we can see that there is a very strong responsibility of this. There is also the risk of offshoring of heavy industries, the risk of carbon leakages that was already mentioned, and the creation of those carbon paradise. And I think it's important to just stop a minute on the notion of carbon footprint, because it's key for trade policies. We usually observe emissions of our developed countries and we can account for them, and sometimes we can see, even if it's really small, a good trend in it, a positive trend. But we need to really take into account not only what is emitted here, but what is embodied in the products that we consume in Europe. And so, for example, the Green Deal, it's based on ambitious targets, but the risk exists that in order to meet them, we offshore those impacts of European consumption in terms of the environment, in terms of human rights also. And so this is not something that is acceptable. And then there is also biodiversity loss that is very strong right now, and deforestation, for example, in rainforests that are key to preserve our conditions of life on Earth. So the idea is what can be done to improve that, and then we can see that there are many blockages to the transition. There is the hierarchy that exists between trade rules and investment protection that is always higher than international law on the different topics that unite us, whether it is the environment or social norms or human rights. And so, for example, the Paris Agreement, it's an agreement on a general trajectory, but it's non-binding. It's based on the voluntary contribution of every country. But then we hope that the sum of all those contributions leads us to a global warming that is not as, that doesn't cross the threshold of 1.5 or 2 degrees. But on the other side, the rules of the World Trade Organization are very clear. They have been thought with the idea that it's the final products that count, as Olivier explained, and it's not possible to distinguish products according to methods of production and production processes, except if it modifies then the final characteristic of the product. And de facto, it removes a real consideration of environmental and social issues in trade discussion. We also see that the new generation of trade agreements like CETA, like the EU-Mercosur, that hasn't been ratified yet and hopefully will be reopened before ratification because it's incomplete right now. While they include provisions for cooperation on regulations. In the EU, we tend to have a stronger environmental and social regulation, and those are often leveled down in international trade discussions. Those new generation trade agreements can also impede the adoption of new regulation in the future. So more ambitious environmental and social policies in the future could be impeached by this kind of provisions. And all of this is because the assessment of regulation are done on the basis of their impact on trade. So trade is an objective per se, and not on the achievement of a desired social and environmental objective. So what we suggest at the Veblen Institute is to rethink trade agreements as a diplomatic tool for social and environmental policies. Of course, there is the idea that we need to reform the WTO. This is necessary, but we know that it will be a long and difficult process. But meanwhile, there are things that can be done by the EU with its trading partner. The EU has a very attractive market, and then it can impose conditions on our trade partners to access to it. So it's about rewriting trade rules in the service of higher political objectives, such as the ecological transition and the fight against poverty and inequality. But one of the the first precondition is the crucial democracy and transparency issue. Negotiations on trade agreements cannot be ongoing behind closed doors as it is now. It cannot be ongoing without civil society consultation, whether it is NGOs, trade unions or consumers associations. And we need to strengthen also the democratic scrutiny by the European Parliament and by national parliaments. And this is a precondition to any of the ambitious idea that we might propose. And then another tool that has to be implemented in a more firm way by the EU is trade sanctions that should be applicable against countries that commit severe environmental and human rights violation. So when we write a trade agreement, we need to impose and to think clauses suspending trade benefits in case of non-compliance of international climate, social and fiscal commitments. So how concretely can it look like? I'm going to develop one of our proposals at the Veblen Institute about mirror measures in agriculture. Maybe first, we need to implement an agricultural exception. Just as there is a cultural exception, we need to recognize the right for a state to implement the necessary public policies to preserve food security. It would protect farmers as well, and also provide an exception for intellectual property rules concerning agricultural seeds. This is also a precondition that is key when thinking about this. And then on mirror measures, we need to be able, and this could be done by a European regulation, we need to be able to deny the European market access to agricultural products that are produced using practices that are banned in the EU. So we will have a report coming on this in the next weeks at the Veblen Institute. And what does it mean? It means that in Europe, so we have among the strongest social environmental standards for agricultural products, but those strong environmental norms do not apply to the products that we import or export. In fact, it means that, for example, for meat, we have standards of animal well-being or antibiotic resistance to fight against antibiotic resistance. But at the same time, the EU imports every year 230,000 tons of beef, 500,000 tons of poultry coming from animals that are treated with antibiotics with growth promoters that are banned in the EU. So we import products that we do not tolerate in our own territory. And then coming from countries, those products come from countries where there is almost no norm in terms of animal well-being during transport, for example. So we have much stronger animal well-being rules in Europe than for the meats that we can import. On pesticides, there is a double problem. On one side, there are pesticides that are forbidden in the EU for health and environmental reasons, but those are still being produced in the EU and exported to developing countries. For example, 20% of all Mercosur imports of pesticides come from the EU. It's a market worth almost $800 million. And major European groups such as Bayer, such as BASF, are massively pursuing the marketing of toxic products that are dangerous for humans and for the environment. And so we have a survey that revealed that the members of the CropLife lobby, which brings together those two agrochemicals, along with others, also American and Swiss companies, generate more than a third of their pesticide sales from products that are classified as extremely dangerous. So this raises questions in terms of biodiversity, which is a global challenge, but also in terms of human rights. How do we accept that we export this kind of products to developing countries?
You are over your 10 minutes. Are you finishing?
I'm finishing, yes.
Good.
So just to conclude on this specific example, we also import products that are agricultural products that are produced with those pesticides, the same that are forbidden in Europe. And this is a real problem also in terms for European farmers, which are the big losers in the absence of a level playing field with operators exporting to the EU. And this makes it also more difficult to have ambitious EU policies. Just to conclude, there is a need to think beyond free trade. Today, the only criteria is whether exchanges improve trade or impede trade, but an increase in trade comes with many side effects. We have talked about this. And so we need to assess trade and change the criteria for assessment in light of higher principles, whether it is environmental integrity, climate targets, social norms, and human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next speaker should be Christian. Are you there? Hello?
Yes.
Good. You're on then.
Yes, thanks, Martin. It seems that I cannot share my screen. I may not share my screen, in fact. I should have access.
I'm still seeing
what I have not.
Should have a share screen facility down at the bottom. Oh, no, it's up at the top, isn't it?
I don't have the share screen facility. Ah, Sarah should stop it first.
How do we get rid of what is on the screen already?
I think that the previous speaker, Sarah, should stop it first, yes.
Okay, so that's stopped.
Okay, now it should work. Yes, it works.
Good, good, good. Well done.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. What has been asked to me is to briefly discuss in 10 minutes the issue, the question: do we need a common EU policy for carbon pricing? Yes, but there is I cannot manage my PowerPoint. There is something wrong, I think. Oh yeah, okay, it works. Yes. So first point: what do we mean by carbon pricing? It may refers to a carbon tax or to tradable permits. There are similarities between both instruments simply because they both instruments put a price on CO2. They ensure dynamic efficiency, if I may use the glossary of economists. To explain it very briefly, if you compare carbon pricing to some norms that are set by regulations, for when new regulations are introduced for cars and for trucks, of course the producer will comply, but they will not go beyond the norm. While with CO2 pricing, there is some continuous incentives to be more energy efficient and to emit less CO2 than before. The main difference is that with tradable permits, the policy set the caps and it's the market that sets the price. Whereas for carbon pricing, it's the opposite. It's the policy that sets the price and it's the market that sets the outcome. Having said that, what I will review in my brief presentation is the economic arguments for and against tax harmonization, then turn to the case of foreign EU policy on carbon pricing and say a few words about the obstacles for an action at the EU level. Tax harmonization or tax competition. It's well known that taxation is a competence of the member state. And the point is often made, though, that they should be free to decide on taxation. And this explains, I think, why there is a limited case for tax harmonization in the treaties. The case is more broad for indirect taxation compared to direct taxation, but it's limited anyway. But we may put the question, but does competition that arises when member states are free to decide, does competition really preserve sovereignty? If I go back to an interesting paper that is 25 years old from Mario Monti when he was commissioner at the EU and responsible for taxation, he issued a paper in which he explained that there is a difference between economic sovereignty and institutional sovereignty. Are you sovereign when you have to decide something because your neighbor has made some decision that you don't like? This is the issue of spatial tax competition. And I also remind from a paper of which the title was very interesting. I've quoted it. It's a paper that was written by Belgian economists in 2008 on spatial tax competition or firm tax rates set in Warsaw. They quote Warsaw, but it could have been any city in the eastern part of Europe. Are we sovereign when we cut our tax rates simply because our neighbors have decided to cut them? Another point is that tax competition may be harmful from an economic point of view, because when tax competition arises and when you have huge difference in tax rate, the result is that location decisions are made on a tax basis rather than on an economic basis, and this result of in profit shifting is rapidly documented that multinational companies are shifting profits in the right way for them, but not for the treasury of the government. But there is a specific case, in fact, for carbon pricing. The first point is that the common EU policy is at work. We are not starting from scratch. We have an European market of tradable permits, the ETS. We have an energy taxation directive that was voted in 2003. I will not say that it was perfect. It was far from being perfect, but we are not starting from scratch. But a more firm point is that policy goals are set at the EU level on carbon pricing. So why should we move away from tax harmonization when we agree on a common tax policy stance? Another point that has to be taken into account is that there is no guarantee that decentralization could deliver a result that should be better. The Paris Agreement and the Green Deal and other international agreements on climate change have a common point. They are on a common good. And this means that the country that is acting alone will pay the full price with no guarantee about the benefit. While on the other hand, non-acting countries will benefit from the policy initiative of active countries. This means that decentralization will not work. We need to work together on carbon pricing. The final reason why there is a case, a quite strong case for a common policy at the EU level, is the other consequence of the location of on the location of economic activity, the issue of carbon leakage, to which Olivier refers in his presentation at the beginning of the panel. So the Green Deal differs from the Paris Agreement in the sense that it clearly sets out objectives directly on CO2 emissions. It's not the only instrument. We may also use incentives, regulations, and so on, but there is a wide consensus that we will not succeed what we aim to achieve with the Green Deal without carbon pricing. So how to make it happen? It's not straightforward, I have to say. There is something that is quite interesting to note. On the one hand, there is a very wide consensus among economists on the carbon pricing. Economists are well known to be divided, to make long statements starting with on the one hand and going on with on the other hand, but there is a wide consensus among economists on carbon pricing. But on the other hand, from a political point of view, we have to say that there are not a lot of countries that have been successful in implementing a sufficient level of carbon pricing. Evidence have been produced recently by the OECD about the very significant part of CO2 emissions that are not priced at all in the world. So it seems to be a story of economics against politics. It means that the political economy issue, how to implement a reform, that the political economy issue is key. In fact, there are two main obstacles for carbon pricing, for the introduction of carbon pricing. There are two main obstacles that is to be overcome. The first one is how to prevent adverse effects on competitiveness and the related consequence on employment. And the second one is how to make it fair. That's the issue of the distribution of energy taxes. On the competitiveness issue, it's, from my view, it has to be dealt at the EU level. First reason for that is that it's the responsibility of the EU to ensure fair competition in the single markets. And the second one is that we need to have a common approach vis-à-vis non-EU countries. That's the issue of carbon, of cross-border adjustment. that has already been touched by Olivier in his presentation. If we look at the let's say what the empirical studies, there are some empirical studies that have been made, and it seems that there is a mixed evidence on the magnitude of carbon leakage, but it's in a context in which the price of carbon was quite low. In the ETS, for example, the price of the CO2 ton was around, after the economic and financial crisis, the price of a CO2 ton was around 10, 12 euro, which is very low compared to what it should be. The level, there is a consensus about the level we need to be around 70, 100 euros for a CO2 ton, and we were far away from that. And carbon leakage seems also to be concentrated in a small number of sectors, cement, for example. So the European Commission has indicated that a proposal will be made on cross-border adjustment in 2021. Let's wait for the proposal. It's clear there is some need for having a cross-border adjustment, because the mixed evidence that we have is in the context of very low price, and we, in the coming years, it's the intention to have price for the CO2 ton that will be clearly higher than 10 to 12 euros for a CO2 ton. Maybe the main reason for cross-border adjustment is what happens when you do not have. This means in the situation that we face, in fact, see quite a long time, it has resulted in exemptions in the case of a carbon tax, or in the case of the ETS for free allocation of permits, and in many cases for free and over allocation of permits. And it's one of the reasons why the price of the CO2 ton has been so low on the ETS. Of course, the exemptions are detrimental to the environment, because in such a situation, highly energy intensive industries are going on producing and emitting CO2. The fairness issue has clearly to be dealt at the national level. It's the issue of how to ensure the recycling of the revenue, and how to compensate for low and middle income households. What are the obstacles, briefly? The first one is
over 10 minutes. Are you
yeah, but it's my final minus one slide. So, there is a diversity of the starting point. The situation of Sweden and Poland are not really the same. And we have the famous unanimity requirement for taxation. But we don't have for tradable permits. There is a very interesting sentence in the communication the Commission issued in December 2019, the Green Deal communication, and I have quoted it in the slide. The Commission will propose to revise the ETD, the Energy Taxation Directive, focusing on environmental issues, and proposing, that's the very interesting part, to use the provision in the treaty to allow the European Parliament and the Council to adopt proposal necessary through the ordinary legislative procedure by qualified majority voting rather than by unanimity. The point is made, I think, that when a decision is taken under qualified majority voting, and that there is something in tax policy that is needed to implement the decision, the tax decision, the tax component of the decision that has been taken under qualified majority voting should not be blocked by unanimity. I think that's what the Commission have in mind. So briefly to conclude, there is a strong case for tax harmonization. The strongest argument is the issue of the common good and the fact that the EU policy is at works. It requires joint action at the supranational and national level, and the EU directive that should do the same work. It should be part at the national level of the policy package that includes fairness, and why the issue of cross-border adjustment should be dealt at the supranational level. Thanks.
If you can unshare your screen.
Yes.
Seems to be important.
Oh, if I
We
had
don't
to
know.
unscreen. How should I unscreen?
That would probably cut off that one because there
Oh, yeah.
seems to be a problem.
I think it's not. It's okay. Yeah. I think that somebody did it for me. Thanks.
So, Jan, you should be the next one. Are you there? I can see.
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. And you can see the PowerPoint as well?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Then glad to be here. And I will start with the question that Martin, you asked me to address. Namely, have past agreements, EU trade agreements, specifically serve to find a balance between environmental and labor rights concerns and liberalization? And I can be very brief. I think the answer is negative, Martin. So I could stop here and stay very well within the 10 minutes limitation that you have put us. Or I can give some more explanation. And I also want to maybe pitch an argument or a question that maybe enforceability, which is also what Olivier de Schutter and Sarah Lickel have suggested here in the panel, is maybe also not the most sustainable solution. But let me start with the basic point on this asymmetry, which has been illustrated very well, I think, already in some of the previous presentations. So we see very clearly in EU trade agreements, you have binding and enforceable chapters, and then you have this one trade and sustainable development chapters, the chapter that includes labor and environmental commitments, which are also binding, but not enforceable. Basically, in terms of substance, these include a non-regression clause, meaning that the parties commit to not lower labor conditions, for instance, with the purpose of being more competitive in trade and investment. And of course, there's also the commitment to the ILO core conventions to ratify them, or at least to take steps towards ratifying them. And in terms of procedures, there is civil society actors that have quite an active role in monitoring the agreements. And also there is a possibility of consultations that can lead to a panel of experts. But again, taking into account that this would not be enforceable. And this is a major source of frustration. I can already disclose some data here that we got from a very recent study that just came out that we did for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung on these domestic advisory groups, these civil society meetings that are set up specifically in the context of a free trade agreement between the EU and a third party. And there is a lot of frustration there. In the DAGs, so the civil society groups outside the EU, but even slightly more inside the EU, there's much frustration on non-enforceability, especially, of course, with NGOs and labor representatives. As you can also see on this figure here, business associations are slightly more optimistic about enforceability and the dispute dimension of the trade and sustainable development agreements. But okay, the overall picture remains that these agreements reinforce the asymmetry that we have seen at the WTO, as Olivier de Schutter has pointed out, that goes back to the Singapore 1996 conference. We see it in taxation again, etc.
Jan, you should shift your PowerPoint on the screen, not on your own version.
Oh, so what I see, right? So you haven't been seeing my slides here? So this is on the
introductory slide.
Am I still at the introductory slide?
Yeah, but can you not? What are you on your own screen then?
Yeah, I'm seeing the slides shifting on my own screen. How could that be? Let's see.
I think you opened two different versions of your PowerPoint presentation, Jan. And we are seeing the one that has not moved since the start.
That must be it.
Oh, there's just one version. That's really strange. Let's see. Is this better?
No. It's still just stuck at your front page.
Now?
No.
Still not.
So
No, I'm shifting slides here on my screen, so this is really strange.
On display mode.
Excuse me?
Is your PowerPoint presentation on display mode, like full screen?
it's not on full screen on what we're seeing.
Right.
You haven't put it in presentation mode. That doesn't matter too much. But you've somehow shared screen with the wrong one.
Do you see it now?
No.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, but I'm afraid I will have to continue, but I don't see how it, I mean, I've been using this Zoom the whole time for teaching and it works always. So apparently,
Here we are.
is this better?
Organizer's question I have
Yes.
now. The trade agreements.
All right. So let me quickly catch up. So this is the point I've been making. This is on the asymmetry. You can see it, right, Martin, now?
I can. Can everybody else? Complain if you can't.
Okay, great. And this is basically what I've been saying. And this, these are the data that I was mentioning on the evaluation of civil society groups, which point to a lot of dissatisfaction on the non-enforceability. And then there are some recent evolutions, as Olivier de Schutter also pointed out. There's a new enforceability discourse, as I would call it, in the EU, which has pledged to be more assertive in pursuing compliance with the TSD chapter. There's indeed a chief trade enforcement officer. There's a call from the Netherlands and from France to maybe make tariffs, make sanctions possible. There's some recent cases also that I would like to elaborate a bit on. And I think basically there are two questions to be asked here. First of all, do these evolutions have the potential of reversing that asymmetry, right? And secondly, is this really desirable? So maybe some breaking news here. Well, it's already 2 weeks ago, but maybe in academic terms, it's still breaking news. There's this panel of experts that issued its report on the Korea case. So Korea failed to ratify some ILO conventions, and in the agreement with the EU, the Koreans pledged to make sustained commitments towards ratifying these ILO conventions. So the good news about this panel report is that it confirms, for instance, that the ILO principles should be applied. It confirms the bindingness, but there are some doubts about the legal ramifications. And I'm not a lawyer myself, but I think that the slightly optimistic evaluation that we also see here at ETUC might be a little overstated if you look at some parts of the panel report. For instance, most clearly, they say, well, yes, Korea's efforts have been less than optimal. You see, they have been less than optimal, but on the other hand, Korea has not acted inconsistently with what it promises in the trade agreement, namely to make continued and sustained efforts towards ratification of the ILO conventions. So this raises some serious questions, and also, of course, the enforceability. So even if Korea would have been clearly and unambiguously been convicted, which is not the case, even then, of course, the enforceability, or rather the lack of it, remains. So I guess this report could have an important moral, political, maybe at some point also legal relevance, but that would then not be sure, and certainly be something for the longer term. Then there's the trade agreement with the EU, right, which also includes something new, which is the possibility of rebalancing measures if there would be significant divergences, if, for instance, the EU would level up its environmental or social legislation and the UK would fail to do that. Well, as the text of the agreement says, if that would have a material impact on trade and investment, qualification 1, and secondly, if we could really have reliable evidence that this is the case, then, well, rebalancing measures are possible. This is already more into the direction of a stronger enforceability. But of course, compared to the full membership scenario, I mean, compared to other agreements, other trade agreements, this is more a step forward towards enforceability compared to the UK membership scenario. Of course, this is a step back. And given what I would call the neoliberal nationalistic tendencies behind the whole Brexit project, it seems unlikely that intense competition between the UK and the EU on labor and social issues would not be taking place, right? And I would expect some serious politicization of this in the years to come, maybe some sort of trade wars, where you can question whether really that stronger enforceability then is sustainable. Finally, the GSP, Olivier de Schutter also mentioned the unilateral instrument, which has indeed already for several decades allowed the EU to take trade sanctions in cases of serious and systematic violations of sustainability commitments. And we see that the EU rarely applies this. It has applied, it used to apply to Myanmar, then it was reintroduced again, Belarus also still, Sri Lanka partially, and now Cambodia. But we see that the EU is reluctant to do this. And also, since the last GSP reform, the number of GSP beneficiaries, as they are called, has been drastically reduced. So the potential of this instrument has actually decreased because many countries don't export under GSP anymore. They do export under bilateral trade agreements or under the most favored nations tariffs. And if you look at the Cambodia case, this is an interesting one. That was sanctions, officially we should say tariff withdrawals, and it were partial tariff withdrawals, were introduced last August. And we will have to see whether that is a sign of increased enforceability indeed, or whether that is more the exception that proves the rule. We will also have to see how the EU is dealing with double standards in applying GSP sanctions, which has often been, for which it has often been criticized, for instance, in the case of Pakistan. And we will have to see what the impact will be on Cambodian labor rights, right? How are Cambodian workers suffering the consequences? To what extent are companies closing down because of these sanctions? To what extent is trade relocated to China, for instance? To what extent do our importers, our multinationals profiting, or that used to profit from the situation in Cambodia, perhaps relocate to other countries, etc. So there's a lot of questions, right? So I don't think you can say that the asymmetry has been reversed. Quite the contrary. Maybe the asymmetry is being strengthened because also the number of free trade agreements and the intensity of the free trade agreements, the level of depth, the intrusiveness of trade agreements also only increases. And then, of course, there's also the case of the comprehensive agreement on investment with China and the issues around forced labor. But the second question is maybe a more intriguing one and a more difficult one for me, namely, would that really be desirable? I think it seems logical, and I have also often argued, just like many academics, and of course many more civil society groups, politicians, unionists, etc., for binding TSD chapters. It seems only logical that if competition provisions in trade agreements are binding, if investment provisions in trade agreements are binding, if services liberalization and of course the tariffs and all that comes with it, if all this is binding, it seems only logical that we create this symmetry in terms of also making sustainable development commitments binding. And I think we are going in this direction. And this might be a good thing. But I think we still have to ask some questions. We still have to wonder, okay, it's probably better to have trade agreements with a binding TSD chapter than to have trade agreements with a non-binding TSD chapter. But nevertheless, one might say that we could go for trade agreements that have non-binding trade provisions as well. Because as has been illustrated very well and with lots of data also by Olivier and Sarah, the case for international trade is dubious. And also I would add to this, also the impact of sanctions or officially tariff withdrawal. The impact of sanctions, especially on the most vulnerable ones, is uncertain, and the impact of sanctions may even be negative. Secondly, there's a lot of discussions on neocolonialism. We're having these debates on decolonization now in all fora and policy domains. And when it comes to trade, that is quite obvious that some work needs to be done there. Now, imposing these some of these conventions through sanctions on so-called developing countries may reinforce neocolonial tendencies, but it may also reinforce a geopolitical tendency in trade policy, which from a progressive perspective is not necessarily a good evolution. The fact that trade is increasingly foreign policy, but foreign policy not necessarily being like sort of a universalistic cosmopolitan normative project, but indeed hard power, hard politics in relation to, for instance, finishing? I am finishing, Russia or China. Then even with binding TSD chapters, trade continues, right? It's merely a lower, well, it's merely putting the tariffs a bit higher, but it does not discontinue trade. Trade is still possible, and also delocalization is perfectly possible. If you sanction Cambodia, we can go to other countries nearby or elsewhere in the world. That's not so difficult. And the point here is that the whole case for enforceability of GSP, of the TSD chapters, does not really question the free trade dogma. So to conclude very briefly, Martin, I think we could pitch the discussion on making agreements non-enforceable entirely and reversing the asymmetry in that way. And I think this would be a way to focus less on the free trade dogma and the growth imperative that is currently behind trade agreements still, with or without binding chapter, and to embed these discussions more into wider paradigms of degrowth, of post-development, of trade justice, and the new social contract, things that have also been discussed at other panels in this conference. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your views on that. But my apologies for the technical issues. I don't know what went wrong, but I'm happy it still worked out.
Good, thank you very much. So, for speakers, I wasn't particularly optimistic at the start that a great deal will be achieved in the near future, and I think I'm no more optimistic now. GSP, I hope, I can't remember what GSP stands for, but that's the conditional agreement, basically with a developing country, that they're able to sell their exports into European Union, United States, whatever country has reached the agreement. Am I right on that? Disagree with me if I've got it wrong. And the particular point with that is you can impose conditions, and as Jan has said, it's actually pretty rare that the European Union has imposed sanctions and kept them for very long. It seems to be quite difficult. Olivier, the trade agreements getting stronger, making progress, but I think that the evidence seems to be that they are not particularly powerful, and enforcement not particularly, well, if enforcement exists at all, not particularly effective. We saw the South Korea one that it didn't seem to come to very much. I think very difficult to enforce sanctions. and strong opposition to doing it, in effect, from a business community that says, why are you cutting off business with this country when all that's happened is that, could we not solve it some other way? I think sanctions happen extremely rarely. So I suppose, and on carbon pricing and carbon tax, is it possible to have carbon pricing within the Union, within the European Union, without a carbon border tax? Are the two, in fact, necessarily part of the same thing? And if so, how can that be achieved? So I think my questions are put back to the panel. Sarah has the Veblen Institute takes it in a more ambitious way, saying, rethink these as a diplomatic tool for social and environmental policy is not the problem. That isn't the way they've developed. It's developed with trade and business being the driving force, and we're trying to add something in that maybe mitigates that effects or ensures that it links up to some positive effects. But the initiative is very clearly with a different way of doing it. So the question that I'm putting back to everybody really is, actually, what do you think we can do or will be done in the near future that will take us to what I think we all agree would be good objectives, would take us towards that? Any of you want to come back on that? Well, I look to see what, yes, Christian.
Yes, thanks, Martin. On the question you put, is it possible to have a carbon tax without any adjustment for borders? I think it's more easy to answer the question if you put it the other way around. It's impossible to have any carbon tax adjustment if you don't have a tax. Because it's clear from the WTO rules, I think, that you cannot impose anything on imports if you don't have the same tax in your country. That's the point. That is quite clear. Now, if I go back to the question in the way you put it, from a practical point of view, the answer is yes. We have countries in the world that have been introducing carbon tax without adjustment at the borders. But the price that they have to pay, that's what I've indicated, is that they have been obliged from a political point of view to introduce exemptions for the sectors that were energy incentives and large exporters. So having one without the other should be detrimental to the environmental objective of carbon pricing. Now, I think there is a difficulty, I think, that have been quoted by Olivier in his presentation, is that I am not a lawyer, I am an economist, but what I have understood is that if you look at the WTO, they say yes, say it briefly, yes, it's possible, let's say, it's not forbidden anyway, to have a carbon tax adjustment at the same level of the tax that you raise on your domestic producers. But the issue, of course, is that if we look at the EU as a whole, what do we mean by the same level if carbon tax are differentiated by countries? We have a single price of carbon under the ETS, but there is no guarantee that we should have a single price of carbon if we are using tax. This means that my impression is that if we, in the case of a carbon tax, the equivalent under the WTO maybe should be the minimum level of the EU, the minimum level of the tax that should be included in the EU, in the new EU, in the new directive that will be put by the Commission in 2021. Olivier.
Yeah, if I may jump in, Martin, I think the presentation by Christian Valenduc was very complimentary to my own, and I agree with him. It's true that from the legal point of view, it's very difficult under WTO rules to justify imposing a border tax adjustment, in other terms, a carbon border tax, without having a harmonized carbon tax in the EU. And we have some spectacular examples in the EU, such as Sweden, that since 1991 has a carbon tax that is now at a very high level of some $130 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, I think. But it's not harmonized across the EU. So from the legal point of view, it will be difficult. And I think what shall be proposed by the Commission is to impose a carbon border tax on the imports from sectors that are now part of the emissions trading scheme of the EU, and to present that as a tax. This is debated amongst lawyers, whether it's a tax or whether it's something different. So it will be not easy legally to justify. But I'd like to say two things. One, it's possible to have a carbon tax within the EU without adjusting at the border. Sweden has done this. And basically the approach of Sweden was to ensure that the ills would be taxed, the polluting industries, and the goods would be de-taxed because the taxes on labor and on poor households have been reduced, and there's been a social benefit to that carbon tax being introduced. So it's not impossible to make progress on the carbon tax within the EU member states, even without this border tax adjustment. But the second point and last point I'd like to make is that between 2028 and 2058, the EU shall have to reimburse the 750 billion euros it is now going to borrow on the financial markets to finance the next generation EU set of instruments. And that will be a unique opportunity to put on the agenda a unified carbon tax for the EU, just like we might have a digital tax or a tax on financial transactions. And the deal we should push for is to have, at the same time that we have this European carbon tax, a border tax adjustment to protect the producers in the EU from competition, which otherwise might be detrimental to them. And I think there is enough support across civil society, environmental NGOs and unions on the one hand, and business enterprises on the other hand, to find that kind of agreement. And that is, I think, the deal we should be looking for.
Okay, any other panel member wish to comment?
Maybe not on that specifically, but on whether our proposals are feasible.
Yes.
I think maybe we need to ask ourselves whether it is possible not to do them. I mean, we have, do we really have the choice? Because without being naive, and we know that there are strong political and economic pressure not to impose more rules, especially for social and environmental standards. But in terms of emission growing, in terms of severe climate impacts, just this week, even in Europe, there was a study coming from Météo France about the severe climate impacts that France might know, and it's not the most severe in the world, but still by the end of the century, it would be summers with heat waves of more than 35 days, it's 50 degrees, and more rain in the winter. We already have strong floods right now in France, so it's not a country where you have severe impacts, but still, even with this kind of climate, we will know some really hot conditions. And then also in terms of deforestation, it plays a role for climate, and we know how much we need the carbon sinks that they represent, that forest represents. We also know in terms of zoonoses, in terms of the pandemic and future pandemic, the role that it can play. So do we really have the choice to not act on those kind of environmental and social measures through trade policies? So I think what we want to say is that it's a political decision. You can have all the legal impediments, but the inaction is still a political decision. You have the WTO rules, but the EU is strong enough to challenge them and to question them and to lead for a reform. So that's something that we need to encourage, and that the EU should take a play in it. So yeah, I think it's whether it is feasible or not, it's really a political choice, and where do we put our priorities?
Any other comment? Or I'll put another question. Pick up a point that Jan made referring to the European Union-UK agreement that has just recently been reached, and saying that he expects that to lead to problems and conflicts in the future. I'll suggest a much more pessimistic view, if you like, that it'll be very difficult to enforce what is included in that agreement over the labour and environmental standards. When we look within the European Union, employment law actually differs between different countries. And to say that something has happened in the United Kingdom that really fundamentally differs from what's within the European Union to such an extent that it has some kind of effect on fair competition and trade will be, I would think, extremely difficult. And over environmental standards, maybe it will work the other way as well. Maybe from the United Kingdom, they will say, well, we've actually got better standards than you have, so you should adopt ours. And I simply can't see how that would work in practice, what you're actually asking them to do. And it fits with my general question of whether these sort of things are in practical terms enforceable. And the evidence that we've had is that there hasn't been very much enforcement of those kind of clauses within trade agreements, which must encourage the view that maybe it's not going to be. So if you'd like to comment on that.
If I can very briefly, Martin, it's of course very difficult to predict what will happen under the agreement. I think the Brexit story has shown also that we political scientists are not so very good at predicting anything, and especially not when it comes to EU-UK relations. But I think your assessment sounds very plausible indeed. And I think the point we want to make is that we can, for a long time, plead for more enforceability, right? And try to reach more enforceability. But once we have that, as you see under the GSP already, actually, once we have that enforceability, and now we do have it under the EU-UK agreement in some complicated form, the next question is, I mean, you open up a whole box of new questions that are very tricky, is when and how to apply it in a legitimate way, and what are the consequences. And okay, when it comes to relations with the global south, so other free trade, I think it's even more problematic, because there you have the whole, you know, sort of neo-colonial dimension and a huge power asymmetry, and less protectionist concerns, let's say. So a whole box of new questions that I think we will see emerging for the very first time in EU-UK relations. And I look forward to hearing what other panelists have to say about this.
Yeah, Olivier?
Yeah, just to react immediately to this, and I first would like to thank Jan for his excellent presentation that goes much further than my own on the topics we overlapped on. Very well informed and useful in this debate. One question to Jan, however, concerning exactly this UK-EU agreement reached on 24th of December. The balancing approaches, the countermeasures that might be applied according to the agreement, in my understanding, would not cover instances of fiscal dumping by the UK. And that's important because in the EU, there is some discipline imposed on the member states to avoid extreme forms of fiscal dumping through soft measures, right? There's a code of conduct on business taxation of 1997 enforced by a group of national representatives that try to encourage states not to aggressively compete against one another by taxation. But that, in my view, would not justify imposing increased tariffs on imports from the UK if the UK decided to completely lower the taxes on businesses, right, to gain a competitive advantage. So my question to Jan is very direct. Are we going to see Singapore upon Thames emerging in the absence of such safeguards applying for fiscal dumping by the UK?
to be honest, I don't know, Olivier. I think your question illustrates very well the complexity and the big challenges we have here around this enforceability. I think I can see Christian is very eager to jump in here.
Yes, I have to say that I'm far from being very optimistic on the issue. There is a room for fiscal dumping from the UK. They are out of all the EU regulation, including the EU Code of Conduct, but they are still member of the OECD, and the OECD has instruments that are quite similar to the OECD Code of Conduct, but they are similar, but they are less binding. But apart from that, it's clear that if the UK decide to cut it across the board, its corporate income tax rate, and to go down to 10%, it's impossible for the EU to impose sanctions. Now, if they introduce a preferential tax regime for companies that are involved in financial services because they are not covered by the agreement of the 24th of December. Now, if they introduce this type of special tax regime for mobile activities, there may be a case for having at least protests and maybe and there should be some concern at the OECD level, because this type of regime should be reviewed by the bodies, by the Committee on Fiscal Affairs at the OECD, and they should have, I think, to repeal it according to the OECD standards. But there is a significant room for fiscal dumping, I think.
You are nodding. You agree, and you have nothing further to add?
Sorry, I understood Christian's comment, but not your question, Martin.
You see that you were nodding, seemingly in agreement with them, and just whether you had anything more to say on that.
No, I think we agree that this is going to be a problem in the next few years. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I think we've run out of time. Am I right? So thank you very much. I don't think we've solved the problems, but we've at least shown that we agree on what the problems are, I think. So with that, I think we take a break. I can't remember what comes next, but I'm sure we can find that out. So good, thank you very much.
Thank you to all. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Now we leave, I think. Thank you all. Good.